OK, I mentioned some breaking news now. I want to catch up with Liberal backbencher Michael Sukkar, who joins us now live from Canberra. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Hi, Chris. Good to be with you.
Look, you are a backbencher, as I mentioned, but you chair a very important committee in the Parliament. That is the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security Matters. And today you've handed down a pretty important report because you've had to look at these proposed laws that would allow the government to keep in jail convicted terrorists even after they've served their sentences. Tell us what your committee is recommending here.
Well, thank you, Chris. You're right. I mean, today was a big day for the government and the Parliament. We handed down the PJCIS report into the High-Risk Terrorist Offenders Bill, which is basically a bill that seeks to ensure that for terrorist offenders that we can keep them incarcerated after their sentences are finished. One of the reasons is that the evidence provides, and our security agencies have certainly confirmed, that many of these terrorist offenders, not only when they arrive in prison, have particularly quite insidious ideological views, but those views harden in prison quite often, and it means that at the end of their sentences they are just as big a danger, if not a greater danger to our community than when they started. So this legislation will ensure that we're able, the Attorney-General's able to make an application to the Supreme Court to keep these terrorist offenders imprisoned for a period of 3 years. And then at the end of that 3-year period, if they still are a threat to our community, the Attorney-General can make another application for 3 years, and so on and so forth.
So your committee has supported these laws? Does it have bipartisan support?
We have strongly supported the laws, Chris, and we've made 23 recommendations in total. Many of the recommendations are relatively minor in ensuring that the explanatory memorandum or the bill itself makes clear its underlying intention. The one significant recommendation we have made is that the bill has a 10-year sunset clause. We think for a significant regime like this, that 10 years is a pretty good period of time to determine how it's working, what improvements need to be made. I think the reality is for the terrorist threat that faces our country, not going anywhere in 10 years, but we think 10 years is a good time to review the legislation and see what amendments, improvements and how it's working in totality.
Well, yeah, I would have thought so, because this is quite a dramatic legal step. Now, you say that your committee's recommended this, so presumably Labor's on board. That means this legislation is almost certain to go through Parliament. Yet this turns sort of legal precedent on its head. You know, we have a system that passes judgment on people, passes a sentence, and when they complete that sentence, they're considered they've served their time and they can leave. Yet this could lead to someone being virtually in jail for the rest of their lives, despite being given a very limited sentence at the start.
Well, the legislation is novel in some respects, Chris, although we have tried to base this to the greatest extent possible on regimes that operate at a state and territory level in relation to most particularly sexual offenders. There has been in the state jurisdictions certainly post-sentence detention for particularly pedophiles, people who the public and governments have decided are unlikely to be rehabilitated. Similar to those sort of offenders, we know that the evidence is clear that for many of these terrorist offenders, they are incapable of being rehabilitated, and we've got a choice as a government. We can say, OK, at the end of your sentence, you're released back into the community, potentially to wreak havoc in our society, or we will make an application with judicial oversight to ensure that you remain in jail. And one example, Chris, and a very, very stark example for all of the Western world was the French priest who had his throat cut at the altar of his church. Well, that particular individual that committed that crime was wearing an electronic bracelet at the time, was being watched by the police, and like this situation was somebody that the French police knew when he finished his prison sentence had not rehabilitated at all, but because they didn't have this regime, he was able to enter the community even though he was being watched. It didn't save that French priest. So I commend Malcolm Turnbull, our Prime Minister. This has really been driven by him he has absolutely given the government, the Attorney-General, myself as the chair of the committee, the imprimatur to do what we need to do to make sure, yes, we've got adequate safeguards and protections in our legal system, but most importantly that we're able to keep our community safe. And I really commend the Prime Minister for his work and imprimatur in ensuring that we're able to do that.
Look, the example you give is a telling one because, of course, if you're a radical Islamist terrorist, if you're a jihadist, then getting caught is the least of your worries. Being a martyr is part of the aim. You mentioned modelling the legislation to a degree on how we deal with sex offenders and pedophiles. I would have thought that most people are worried that we don't actually exercise those powers often enough, that too often people who are a risk to the community are released into it. So I think most people would be supportive of this as long as the judgment and the checks and balances are there. You say the Attorney-General, obviously on the advice of security agencies, would make an application and it would go to the Supreme Court. Would it be a single judge in each case who would make this decision?
Well, the ordinary rules would apply, so of course there would be a single judge, but they'd be subject to appeals, of course. I mean, in a sense, we want to ensure that that when the Attorney-General and when we ultimately do, when we're ultimately successful in having somebody held post-sentence, that that nobody can point to there being a flaw in the legal process and the legal system, and that's why the Attorney-General's been very careful in making sure that that all of the judicial checks and balances apply that would in an ordinary course of events, and that is why it'll go through the Supreme Court as other cases of these sort of nature. So, Chris, we as a committee have really been focused on ensuring that there are the appropriate balances. We don't want ever a situation where the rule of law is in a sense, affected by a regime like this. But the number one priority for us, the absolute guiding principle for the government, for our committee, and in a bipartisan sense, both the Liberal Party and the opposition, has been the safety of the community. That is our number one objective, and of course we must ensure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, as far as our judicial system. But we have to evolve in a changing security environment to being able to deal strongly with these terrorist offenders. And I mean, you make a good point, Chris, about the state regimes that have applied with sexual offenders. We don't want these laws on the statute books that are incapable of being used. These will only be effective if the Attorney-General can actually make applications and ensure that the worst terrorist offenders remain in prison for so long as they are not rehabilitated. And look, I'm very, very comfortable that the appropriate checks and balances are in place, but in 10 years and with reviews throughout, we'll be able to determine if we need to tweak the legislation to make sure it's working.
Yeah, when the powers are that strong, a 10-year review, I think most people would agree is sensible. But tell me about the need for this legislation now, because we know, of course, that there are bad eggs on our streets now. We know that there have been police operations on and off over the last number of years breaking up terror plots and terror cells. We also know there's some extremely radicalised jihadists from Australia who have been active in Syria and Iraq under Islamic State, and we're worried about any of those slipping back into the country. But the government must be worried about, there's a couple of dozen, serious convicted terrorists in Australian jails now with some major plots that have been foiled going back close to a decade now. How many of these current inmates is the government actually worried about, probably looking at applying this law to as soon as it can be passed through Parliament?
Great question, Chris. I mean, I don't want to be too specific because we don't want to foreshadow which individuals that we
I understand that,
mind.
but I'm gathering that your committee would have actually got some discrete briefings on this about a current issue here that needs to be dealt with.
Absolutely, we did receive discrete briefings, and I'm hoping to keep them relatively discreet. But you're about right. I mean, it's in the teens as far as those convicted offenders that are currently in prison that we think could be subject to this regime. There are up to about 40 people who are facing charges at the moment that would prima facie potentially be subject to this regime. And as you say, there is a very large cohort of individuals who have fought in Syria and Iraq. Obviously, we are trying to ensure that dual nationals have their citizenship, potentially have their citizenship stripped before they come back, but inevitably some of those will be Australian citizens, and when they come back, they will have all of the tools and all of the skills and that bloodthirstiness that they will have learnt offshore. So the number there is, you know, potentially 10, 20, 30, 40. We don't exactly know. So we're talking about overall, Chris, probably a cohort, you know, up to 100 people. And some of the public advice that we received from the AFP is that even if you could watch these individuals 24 hours a day, not only is it prohibitive in a cost sense, costs up to $4 million per person per annum to watch them around the clock, as we saw with that offender in France who was being monitored by the French police. It cannot stop somebody, as you say, Chris, who doesn't care about their own life from very, very dire circumstances for our community. So we don't think that for the absolute worst of those offenders, control orders where we're watching individuals in the community is enough. The only absolute fail-safe way of keeping the community safe is having those people behind bars. And, you know, the cohort is relatively large, potentially, and one of the things that this committee has recommended, and I think we need to work with the states on this, is to see and explore what additional rehabilitation can be undertaken.
Yeah,
I'm a bit pessimistic.
Yeah. Good luck
honest.
with that. Yeah, I'm not
a
too
bit pessimistic about rehab, but
yeah, rehabilitating Islamist extremists, I don't think is a venture that's got a high probability of success. Before we run out of time, I do want to move on to the domestic political scene more generally. You came into politics in the 2013 election, so you're into your second term in government. Normally you say that any day in government is better than you know, a year in opposition. You've never experienced the horrors of opposition, but gee, it's been a horrible three or so years for you in government. You must be thinking, oh, you can't imagine how tough opposition must be.
Well, as you say, Chris, I've got no way of comparing it, but I absolutely love every day in this job. And whilst there are times up here in Canberra, like all of us, I sort of want to tear my hair out, I do absolutely enjoy every day in government. And I think what we're starting to see now is the government gaining some momentum. We're getting some legislative wins on the board.
Well, if I could just interrupt you there, this is exactly what I want to get your reaction to, because I think the opposite seems to be the case. You had a couple of wins there going back a few weeks ago, but now we're hearing about the ABCC and the registered organisation bills being delayed because of the strife in the Senate. You know, 3 senators have sort of dropped off the scene over the past couple of weeks, so you may not even be able to get your double dissolution trigger bills up. The government seems to be under the attack daily in the Parliament about chaos and dysfunction. We're not getting a clear message about what the government's agenda is. Just when do you think you will be able to, as a government, give this sense of momentum, perhaps more importantly, of just competently getting on with the job?
Well, Chris, I think we have been competently doing that. You're right. I mean, the issues in the Senate now may delay those 2 industrial bills, which I think, along with the national security legislation that we're progressing, hopefully we can still get it through. Will be a nice way to finish the year. But there are some things that are just outside the control of governments. And look, I can understand why the opposition would try to lay everything at the feet of the government's fault. But I don't know how we as a government can be blamed for our political opponents. I mean, let's remember, these 2 individuals are our political opponents. They're not members of our government having questions over their eligibility to stand. So these are just, in my view, speed bumps that get in the way of governments, but good governments just plough on through, and I think we will. Obviously, Labor has got a strategy. It's a pretty basic sort of strategy of trying to, in a sense, create this sort of chaotic vibe around Parliament.
Gee, I wonder where they might have learned that from. I wonder where they would have got some tips on that from. Thanks very much, Michael Sukkar. I'm being facetious, of course. I was thinking of how of course, Tony Abbott in opposition was a master at doing that with the Gillard and Rudd governments. But I appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us here on Viewpoint, Michael Sukkar.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Chris.
That was Michael Sukkar.